Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to get week 93 of the TTT underway with another Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, after spending Series 11 in Rohan, we've been spending Series 12 in Gondor, beginning with Anorion. We spent a couple of weeks looking more closely at the Beacon Hills of Gondor before strolling through the Druadan Forest and making our way through Stonewain Valley. Today, let's take a closer look at the lands of the Pelennor and the Rammas Echor that surrounds them. Now, we'll start with the Rammas Echor, as Pippin encountered a northern portion of the wall on the way to Minas Tirith. Pippin woke to the sound of voices. Another day of hiding and a night of journey had fleeted by. It was twilight. The cold dawn was at hand again, and chill gray mists were about them. Shadowfax stood steaming with sweat, but he held his neck proudly and showed no sign of weariness. Many tall men, heavily cloaked, stood beside him, and behind them, in the mist, loomed a wall of stone. Partly ruinous, it seemed, but already, before the night was past, the sound of hurried labor could be heard. Beat of hammers, clink of trowels, and the creak of wheels. Torches and flares glowed dully here and there in the fog. Gandalf was speaking to the men that barred his way, and as he listened, Pippin became aware that he himself was being discussed. Now later, after a conversation with Ingold, a soldier of Minas Tirith, Gandalf offers some counsel.
And as for counsel, to you I would say that you are over late in repairing the wall of the Pelennor. Courage will now be your best defense against the storm that is at hand. That and such hope as I bring. For not all the tidings that I bring are evil, but leave your trowels and sharpen your swords.
The wall of the Pelennor, that's the wall of stone that was partly in ruins, as Pippin noticed, is the Rammas Echor. And right after this, the narrative of the story gives us a very detailed description of this defensive structure. Gandalf passed now into the wide land beyond the Rammas Echor. So the men of Gondor called the Outwall that they had built with great labor after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy. For 10 leagues or more, it ran from the mountain's feet and so back again, enclosing in its fence the fields of the Pelennor, fair and fertile townlands on the long slopes and terraces falling to the deep levels of the Anduin. At its furthest point from the great gate of the city, northeastward, the wall was 4 leagues distant, and there, from a frowning bank, it overlooked the long flats beside the river, and men had made it high and strong, for at that point, upon a walled causeway, the road came in from the fords and bridges of Osgiliath, and passed through a guarded gate between embattled towers. At its nearest point, the wall was little more than 1 league from the city, and that was southeastward. There, Anduin, going in a wide knee about the hills of Emin Arnin in South Ithilien, bent sharply west, and the outwall rose upon its very brink, and beneath it lay the quays and landings of the Harland for craft that came upstream from the southern fiefs. So, what do we learn from this? Well, first we learn, when it was built, after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy. Well, that happened shortly after Sauron returned to Mordor in 2951, right? It was only 3 years later, in 2954, that the last men fled Ithilien. It's now 3019, so it's only been 65 years. If that's the case, then it was likely built under Ecthelion II's leadership as he ruled from 2953 to 2984. But as you might have picked up from my tone, there is a problem. In Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion, they cite Tolkien's unfinished index to The Lord of the Rings, Rammas, a great wall, Echor, outer circle, the great wall about the Pelennor, built under Denethor's lordship, also called the Rammas Index. That's where that is located. So a few thoughts here. While we do get the word nerdery, right, the outer circle wall, what's more interesting is when it was built. First, this is the unfinished index, so we could just say the entry might be in error. Second, the entry could be referring to its rebuilding taking place under Denethor's leadership and not its initial building. Still, if this index entry is right, it's a bit odd because Denethor has been the ruling steward for only 35 years. For a stone wall to fall into disrepair this badly in such a short time seems highly unlikely. But one possibility that fits both the under Denethor's lordship from the Index and after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy in the text is for the Rammas to have originally been built in the rule of Denethor I. Now, looking in Appendix A, we read, "In the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks, black orcs of great strength, first appeared out of Mordor, and in 2475 they swept across Ithilien and took Osgiliath. Boromir, son of Denethor, after whom Boromir of the Nine Walkers was later named, defeated them and regained Ithilien, but Osgiliath was finally ruined and its great stone bridge was broken. No people dwelt there afterwards." Now, they did return later to Ithilien, and that's why I was originally looking to 2954 as the time the wall was built. But if it was built under Denethor I instead of Denethor II, that would make the Rammas nearly 550 years old, not 35 and not even 65. But that would certainly fit with the state of ruin that Gandalf finds the wall in at this point. Now, in this passage, we also learn about the shape of the Rammas. It's an asymmetrical, mostly circle, that's 30 miles or more in total length for 10 leagues or more, right? That's what the text says. Now, when you plot out the 2 points that are given as the farthest from the gate, the Causeway Forts, some 12 miles to the northeast, and the nearest to the gate, Harlond, a little over 3 miles to the southeast, you get a pretty clear idea of this not-quite circle, with Minas Tirith itself south and a bit west of the center of the circle. The wall is a defensive structure. It makes sense for Gondor to defend there at the Causeway Forts. Denethor sending Faramir there, as he does in the books, is actually not a bad idea. Now, to be clear, movie Denethor sending movie Faramir to attack Osgiliath, a city, with a small cavalry force is a very, very bad idea. But Book Denethor is doing the smart thing, using defense in depth to give them time. As he says, "We should not lightly abandon the outer defenses, the Rammas made with so great a labor." And perhaps if the Black Captain himself had not been leading Mordor's forces, the defense might have held longer. As it was, though, Faramir retreated to the wall of the Pelennor, rallying his men to the Causeway Forts. The wall was then taken, using blasting breaches, and then Gandalf brought the news back. With a handful of horsemen he came in the middle morning, riding as escort to a line of wains. They were filled with wounded men, all that could be saved from the wreck of the Causeway Forts. Faramir was himself with the rear guard, attempting to prevent the retreat from becoming a rout. And now we've spent so much time on the Rammas Echor itself, more than I thought we would, we'll need to save the fields at the Pelennor themselves for next week. If we're lucky, we'll also make it to the wall and gate of the city of Minas Tirith itself. For now, though, folks, that wraps it up for Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, eventually, someday, I'll go back to Mailbag Mondays. So if you have any questions for me, email them to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Be sure to let Barliman know your question is for today's Tolkien Times. Now, to those of you who support the TTT on Patreon, thank you. Your support gives me the ability to invest my time and resources into researching, writing, and recording these episodes. Now, if you're not yet supporting the show, please consider visiting patreon.com/Tolkien Times. You can join the TTT Content Council to help me decide what to talk about. You get a bonus episode every week and more. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as we return to the revised letters for our continued series of Tolkien Tuesdays. Podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to the channel to get all of the PPP productions. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.